Welcome, everyone. This is a really exciting discussion. There's been a lot of fear and excitement and trepidation and just discussion, I know, on the CASY Facebook page about AI and its many applications. People are very much pro or very much con, and I hope we can meet in the middle today. This should be really interesting. So Samantha's going to do a little bit of a presentation. I think she's got some questions to ask along the way, and then we'll have Q&A afterward. If you want to say something, just raise your hand in the frame or use the icon under the reactions button. Also, if you're using the chat and you want us to read your comment or question out loud, just put read right before so we know that it's something you want to share with everyone. Everyone's always kind, so I don't need to remind you about that. Let's make sure everybody gets a turn. I'm sure folks will have a lot to say. And with that, I'll turn it over to Samantha.
Absolutely, that's lovely. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Wonderful, it's working, yes? Excellent. And so I'm Samantha, go by she or pronouns, and I'm an English doctoral student here at Emory University, and I also dabble in bioethics. I'm also an autist discussing the ethical considerations of diagnosing autism with AI. And this is really a way to think about centering autistic lived experience in all of these considerations. What does it actually mean for autism as a diagnosis to be changed by new technologies? And I really wanted to emphasize the community discussion portion of the title. This is an opportunity to think about the ethical considerations of diagnosing autism with AI. And so this really definitely isn't an argument in favor of or even against. We are here to sit with those uncomfortable ethical situations. So while this talk focuses on autism diagnosis, there are other AI categories, such as assistive technologies, that influence the way that autism is perceived in society and culture. And so essentially, the kernel of the thesis is that the formulation of AI technologies and categories such as disability are co-constructed in a way that is bidirectional. And what I mean by that essentially is that AI technologies have the capacity to reify stereotypes, assumptions, and dominating medicalized and cultural narratives about disability. At the same time, there is hope that disability advocacy and neurodiversity as a framework, movement, and paradigm have the power to reshape AI technologies and other forms as support systems to more autism to its social, cultural, political, etc. dimensions in medical practice and in healthcare systems. And so, as I have this talk today, I really want to thank Dr. Stephanie Larson for her collaboration and support with this project. This product arose out of a manuscript from a kind of brainstorm, and it really just evolved into this cluster of kinds of considerations. And that's exactly what we're going to center today. And so let's just open with a brief kind of reflection. What is our current relationship to technology? Right here, we have a cat in front of a computer. It looks like it's staring at the screen, but for anybody who has a cat or has interacted with one, it might be more likely that you're just sat on top of any kind of machine because it likes the warmth. That was my cat with its television console way back in the day. And so not all technology is actually AI. We'll get to that definition later. We have Zoom as a way to think about how we connect with each other, to hold this online space and forum, to really have a community, to empower each other. As we're also well aware, online forums can be a way to spread disinformation, misinformation about autism and other groups, to send anonymous and thoughtless YouTube comments and to, engage in new ways to bully each other, to essentially be a troll. And so, how you use technology in everyday life matters. Technology changes our habits. Right now, I'm reflecting on Google Maps or the use of that kind of navigation system to know how to go about things. As someone who often uses that kind of technology, it's difficult for me to imagine a time where you use paper maps in order to navigate spaces and roads and directions. Now, let's think a little bit about technology in healthcare settings. How have you encountered it? In many respects, you might have encountered a technology, such as a kind of app that you might use to access some of your test results and electronic records. These kinds of technologies change the way we process information about ourselves, how we process those tests, and how we interact with clinicians. So just take a moment to reflect on your own experience to situate our discussion. If you feel comfortable doing so, please write in the chat, reflect to yourself. And if you want to, maybe one person can share out, and there is absolutely no pressure to do so. Here, silence is just as valuable as speaking. Just take a moment to let you digest all of that. As we're lingering on that question, oh yes, does somebody have a microphone open? Yes, mixed feelings I see in the chat. Absolutely. Mixed feelings indeed. Yes, please feel free to share out if you would like to. All right, let's move on. Just as a brief agenda. Oh my goodness, poor agenda. There we go. Essentially, here's a breakdown of what we're going to do. First, we're just going to define some terminology so that we have a ground zero to work with. And then we're just going to do a brief introduction to AI ethics and autism. And then we're really going to dive into the complexities of autism diagnosis and really just have a dialogue about this topic. There we go. Defining autism and neurodiversity. This in of itself could be its own hour-long discussion. For the purposes of this conversation, what is autism? Essentially, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. And so I have this sort of essentially more medical definition right above. With autists often have difficulties in social functioning, reciprocity, communication, and sensory processing. And this kind of perspective is that autism is a developmental disorder caused by neurological differences in the brain. And so common traits include difficulties communicating, maintaining friendships, and engaging in social interactions. And there might also be characteristics such as sensory overload to certain sensory outputs. For example, I can't stand buttons. Don't know why, but have never been able to wear them. And down below, we have a more sort of socially inclined definition. And that's that people with autism have reclaimed a deficit only definition of the term and reframed it as part of their entire selves. And we can think about autism as an identity that's differentiated along intersectional axes, such as gender and race. And so, if we think about autism and its definitions in relation to technology, biases in AI and technology systems are reiterated from interpersonal and structural forms of oppression, such as ableism, is racism, all of the other isms. And so the term is not a stand-in, autism, for the experience of the thing itself, autistic experience. And that's just to point out that there's some tension between this medical definition of autism as well as the more socially inclined one. And so we could also think about a kind of definition of autism that considers the built environment. So I would encourage you to think about what autism is to you and how is your perspective of autism influenced by technology, such as autism lifelinings and blogs, such as the community and online space that we have. And so now I'm going to dive into what is neurodiversity. And this is ripped straight from an online resource from Walker. Is the diversity of human minds the infinite variation of neurocognitive functioning within our species? And this really is a term that to describe also a movement that celebrates neurological difference and argues that disability arises from social, political, and historical conditions, as well as ideas about biology. And so, another way to think about this is a critique of this deficit only model of autism. And so, hence, at all proposed developmental diversity in autism research, which would account for a person's experience in a kind of a long term capacity, or what it's like to actually have a life with autism. And so, accounting for autism lived experiences and stories is one way to co create studies and technologies that can enact inclusion and disability justice in the healthcare environment. At the same time, that very sentence itself is so fraught, and there are so many contexts and circumstances that undermine that its very foundation. And so the ethical challenges of diagnosing autism with AI is linked to all of these sorts of underpinnings. So transversing this diagnostic category of autism requires reconceptualizing autism as a socially constructed and value-laden term. When it comes to acknowledging the biases in human-made technologies and processes, one way to think about this is that accounting for neurodiversity and really celebrating it can be a way to reframe AI technologies as support systems. One thing to keep in the back of our mind is what are some ways to actually do this? Is this even possible with all of the challenges? And let's dive into some of those challenges with defining AI, otherwise known as artificial intelligence. This definition is just ripped straight from the FDA. It's a machine based system that can, for a given set of human objectives, make predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing real or virtual environments. It's used in machine and human based input systems to perceive these sorts of situations. Think about this: a calculator is a piece of technology, but the four function calculator isn't the same as a self driving car that would essentially make its own decisions with its own series of inputs and outputs in the moment. Just to give some more context, machine learning is a set of techniques that can be used to train AI algorithms to improve performance at a task based on data. Methods combining, clinical, social demographic, and biomarker data. So one way that we can think of as an example is like an AI allocation system that could be used in organ transplants. And so an AI system that would essentially allocate organs in this kind of process is an example of this kind of technology. Another way to think about this kind of technology is the idea that racial biases exist in AI systems that have allocated organs. And so there we go. We have that bias, and we also have the technology itself. And so other methods have been used to just develop screening tools to identify psychiatric disorders, air quotes here, and a question mark next to that term, and just such as other places like generalized anxiety and depression. And AI tools also sometimes implement natural language processing, essentially to help perpetuate therapy and mental guidance. And so, one example of this in terms of autism is a machine based learning algorithm that is used to diagnose the term based on eye tracking technology. If you do a quick Google search of AI, you take a look of its AI generated AI definition up at the top bar, and it's essentially the capability of computational systems to do tasks that require human reasoning. Essentially, AI is more or less a metaphor or a stand-in or some kind of surrogate for human reasoning capacity functioning, problem solving, and intelligence. Herein lies the very issue with the definition of AI. Where is the intelligence in it? Treating AI technology as if it can think for itself, even if it's trained on human made data, software, and such, with man made processes. And so, what is in between that input and output, so to speak? And so, the creation and use of AI is value laden and contextual. Let's turn to an example, essentially, of a study. And here you can see it cited on the slide of Shroud et al. Of 42 physicians, in these interviews, they were asked about their perspective of the use of AI in the evaluation, diagnosis, and treatment of psychiatric conditions. Essentially, the kind of cornerstone of this is that physicians highlighted the benefits of tools such as support to increase efficiency, reducing kind of administrative burden, maybe potentially being an aid in shared decision-making processes, and even increasing access to health term services. That's the kind of optimism in these kind of interviews. And then there was also some kind of consideration of the risks, such as misguiding clinical judgment, increasing clinical burden, introducing patients to newfangled harms, and also creating legal liabilities. And so, how do we actually process the creation and use of these new technologies in real time? In many respects, technological innovation and creation moves ahead of ethical conversations. And so here I have this word cloud activity, and you can take a look at terms such as justice, co-creation, fairness, trust, accountability. Do these values always give rise to action? And in many ways, we can also think about how you would define the terms. Would our definitions be included in folks' processes? What's important to you and what would you add? And here I just wanted to make a plug for relational autonomy, which is this idea of being an independent agent doesn't exist without relationality or supported engagement. And so here I also wanted to plug a term from Percy and Elster, and that's this idea of supported engagement as going a step beyond relational autonomy and taking a look at between individuals and their communities. And that would be just to create a broader society to allow decisions and processes to be truly operational and to recognize that decisions about health are intertwined with social and relational decisions. There is no kind of diagnostic process that's made in a vacuum. We can also draw out questions from sources such as the American Medical Association's Augmented Intelligence Development, Deployment, and Use in Healthcare. That was verbose. So, according to the AMA, healthcare AI must be designed, developed, and deployed in a manner which is ethical, equitable, responsible, reasonable, accurate, transparent, and evidence based. And we might then ask how to define and enact these values, to be accountable to them, and to build a consensus among different community members. And this would really be a call to include autistic community members at every stage of the process, to truly treat autists as creators, knowers, and to compensate us fairly for our work, and to really ask again and again, who does this new technology benefit? We might also turn to this idea that the AMA suggests that clinical decisions influenced by AI must be made with a specified qualified human intervention at certain points of the decision-making process. What does this look like from institution to institution? What is the role of clinical judgment in specific settings? These are just some questions that we can ask from this topic. And this word cloud, you can also think about what you would subtract or add, is a way to just think about a brief introduction to AI ethics and autism. So autism has such vast manifestations and representations that it's important to map how AI and healthcare technologies can shift or influence a person's experience of medicine. And so AI ethics, or the ethics of these technologies, and neurodiversity in of itself have such complex moral underpinnings. And so while moral frameworks are not the focus of this kind of discussion, they should be scrutinized later, or as they are now, to create robust processes and procedures to make good by us, for autists, for community members. And so here we have this sort of idea that oftentimes assistive technologies reinforce neurotypical norms to quote unquote correct autist behavior and or functioning. And this would be the intervention or intention of the AI system without going back and reflecting on how that kind of intervention would actually influence, let's say, folks' view of autism, how autists would even perceive themselves as needing fixing or correcting. And so here's an example with human computer interaction with robots. And so robots, or ones that you interact with, which might or might not have machine learning elements, have often been framed as a way for autistic children to learn socially appropriate behavior. So here in this kind of formulation, interacting with a robot is meant to be a surrogate in order to learn how to interface with people. And so a lot of the times the benefits of human computer interaction robots are framed kind of with this corrective lens. And so there's actually a point where one might question that there are a few studies of human robot interaction among, let's say, neurotypicals with this similar orientation towards correcting or fixing. And then you might also wonder about the underlying ideas of that perspective. And so, without considering the perspective and voices of autists, AI and assistive technologies can reinscribe neuronormativity and essentially fix boundaries between neurotypicality and neurodiversity. A lot of the times, AI posits a kind of static definition of disability, of complex lived experiences such as autism, in a way that wouldn't be flexible to the variations and changes a person might actually experience when they process a diagnosis or the term. And so another example is the complexity of AI ethics and language, such as the autism and machine metaphor. And so machine metaphors frame autism as incomprehensible, incoherent, and unknowable. It's a string of comparisons to autistic folks as quote unquote missing puzzle pieces, confusing aliens, impenetrable forces, or even malfunctioning robots, unfeeling machines. And so to this end, machine metaphors can symbolize allegories of inhumanity, animality, and others, and other stereotypes. Essentially, the machine metaphors in autistic clinical history have roots in early links to detachment, coldness, and emptiness. So our ideas about autists and machines don't arise out of nowhere. It's important to consider, let's say, kind of formulation in media, such as the savant as a computer, supercomputer, a savant genius montage, which again collapses and narrows the diversity of autism. And so how autists are alienated and stigmatized in relation to technology-related language also matters. And so here, let's turn to some more examples. We have AI, emotional recognition, and neurodiversity. So speech, text, and facial recognition software recognizes common objects, text, logos, captions, and other properties. And so people with autism might express emotions differently than neurotypical individuals, which can result in inaccurate classifications about their emotions, well, expressions, and personalities. I'm sorry, that was a quick glitch in the system. And to that end, I actually lost my speaker notes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing so that I can retrieve those notes again. Thank you very much for your patience. I appreciate all of you. Don't we love technology, everybody?
I think in the meantime, maybe I'll read a comment that is designated to be read here. I think I lost it. Okay. What they are looking for is an important question, because if they are looking for DSM features, it's likely they are actually just looking for trauma responses and strategies, sadly. If autistic people were in charge of this kind of project, we would look for positive characteristics, I think, like pattern seeking, unique holographic holism between the person and the environment, etc.
Exactly. That's such an interesting thing to think about how when there's an AI system to map this view of autism, it's usually from the DSM-5. And so what does the DSM-5 miss out on? It would be those positive characteristics. And the DSM-5 isn't the only location for potential biases. To pivot back from that lovely comment to the presentation, hiring and grading criteria have accuracy and fairness issues in attempts to standardize a pool of folks with such a diverse diagnosis, such as autism. And so this also suggests that stuff such as emotional and facial recognition software might also have pre-existing biases about disability in their outputs. There are also potential harms of allocation, a wrong prediction, and an automatic hiring system. Information retrieval is used to power web search engines and can implicitly amplify pre-existing bias. Quality of service might be an issue with voice automated smartphones that might not account for multiple communication methods. Stereotyping and over or underrepresentation might amplify existing biases in data pools. And so technology use, data sets, and technological processes already overdetermine the social category of disability. As another example, Jeff Nagy's studies examined how facial recognition technologies were formulated in terms of autism and emotion recognition. So one real life example of affective affects that used autism to justify its existence, its intervention, develop a commercial emotion AI. And so essentially, autists were recruited in order to test and make this emotional recognition software. And that would be for a software that could be deployed in spaces like political rallies or, in just kind of situations. And so after thinking about the conceptual elements of autism used to create emotional AI, this kind of research turns in a sense, of viewing autists more as test cases just in the development process. And since this is a software developed for commercial use, the intersection of autism and affective computing underscores the multifaceted ethical dilemmas of current day research and situations. And so with that being said, we'll transition to a slide that is more aligned with the comment, which is the ADOS. And that's essentially the Autism Diagnostics Observation Schedule. Well, to test whether only a subset of behaviors can differentiate between children on and off the spectrum. It relies on essentially behavioral observation in the clinical setting and consists of 4 modules. Module 2 is reserved for individuals with some vocabulary, and Module 3 for individuals, quote unquote, this is ripped from the very definition itself too. And so this is the voice of the so-called machine here, higher levels of cognitive functioning. Essentially, the last time that I checked, the cutoff was age 4. So a lot of the testing is actually done on with children or pediatric populations. And so this idea of how, autistic adults might actually work with these technologies is another kettle of fish. And with this study that I have cited here, the ADOS is not actually administered in its entirety. According to this study, competencies had an 81% accuracy, as much as a 96 to 98 for a selected set of traits of using an AI technology to map traits of ADOS. Essentially, the demographic data could be clearer, and each iteration is taken as a 1-to-1 ratio for classification to autistic trait. There is also no guide for communication for use. And again, as we have pointed out, autistic traits are defined purely in medicalizing terms. And so what would it actually be like to have some neuroaffirming language in these systems? And can something like natural language processing, speech recognition, text classification, natural language really save time? If it does, what trait slips through the cracks? What about the communication or of the use of this technology to patients? And so a clinician's responsibility to convey information about the use of AI and to use their own expertise and experience might create conflict with the output of the diagnostic system from the AI. If this case, if the clinician is accountable for the use of AI, how should overriding an AI's diagnosis be communicated to the patient? And this also goes back to this legal liability issue, as if there is an error, who, does the responsibility fall on? And so on the flip side, improving clinicians' abilities to communicate their use of AI would create some complexities within an already complex healthcare environment. And now we can actually turn to our gut reaction to this topic itself. What is unsettling to AI? And so this is definitely an ethical approach that is oriented and attentive to how you feel. And so AI has been purported as a way to improve the accuracy and effectiveness of autism diagnosis. At the same time, AI uses data analysis models from question-based results. Data might be collected in a way that displays differences and a deficit-only scope. And as I mentioned before, AI has a kind of tendency to produce simplistic classifications that are not necessarily flexible, mobile, adaptable, creative. So blurring experience impairments and a person's experience of autism presents many complex challenges. And so this goal isn't really to give a concrete answer to every single question, but to provide a forum to sit with the unsettling aspects of this question. We won't resolve every ethical tension for every situation in this hour, but we can unpack a few of them. And now let us turn to autism diagnosis. This is one of the terms here of what does autism diagnosis actually mean. So one important aspect of diagnosis could be creating a sense of certainty. Overall support for the use of AI in rare disease diagnosis is patients' perceptions of increased diagnostic certainty. And so Hallowell et al. Found that in the context of rare disease diagnosis, AI use has disruptive elements to the diagnostic process that have positive and negative elements. For example, there is a neurosymbolic AI that is designed to mimic a human neural network. How would you read and interpret these outputs? How would you communicate with community members? How would you treat autists as co-creators and knowers? And that's to shift a fundamental understanding of the diagnostic process as only marking out this kind of fixed trait or set of deficits and differences, and really to redefine and broaden autism itself. And you could also think about autism diagnosis as a means to access and resource, and also kind of its own troubled context too, because that would be to include a neurodiversity lens in the diagnostic process, to reframe medical diagnosis as a way to potentially attain support system resources without having the overwrought considerations of stigma. At the same time, diagnosis is nonlinear. It's medicalized. Treatment involves the creation and use of categories and ideas about who can define what is and is not normal. And there's a concern that at present, AI might only be able to process a static definition of disability. And so all of these newfangled technologies might be in the way of questions such as, how do clinicians accompany patients during the diagnostic process, of which not everyone has access to? Diagnosis is jagged. Do AI interventions and conversations surrounding them only about lived experiences and built-in healthcare disparities? How does the use of AI fit with those realities? And so you can't simply add AI and stir to make sense of a diagnosis or a narrative. Stories are about as complex as an individual can say. And if you create data out of narratives, what is necessarily being lost and recollected and remembered in this process? And so now we're going to turn to our discussion. And these essentially are ripped straight from news sources. And so I just have a couple of cases for us to think about. And that would be one, which is an app that will allow parents to upload videos and information to an app, and essentially to use an algorithm to make an assessment of a diagnosis. What are some questions about the creation and use of technology? And how do you balance access to diagnosis with quality of care and communication? And so essentially, Wyoming is the first state to let Medicaid cover this online tool. And essentially, the kind of upshot here is that it can increase, the amount of access to diagnosis and also shorten the amount of time. And so a lot of folks might have to travel hundreds of miles to see someone who can give this diagnostic test. And at the same time, you might also consider the kind of parameters of this technology, which is children between 18 months and 6 years old. And at the same time, you could also think about actually how does this technology potentially delay care if you have a false negative diagnosis? And you also wonder if the app is actually is as effective as having somebody in person and screening. There are just a lot of question marks here. And it isn't to say we should run off and have a train with our anxieties. It's just to think through about the pros and cons of this technology. And so we might also think about if this is sort of intervention or sort of way of diagnosis is something you would want for yourself or a loved one. How to build a healthcare system that can respect patient autonomy while reframing that diagnosis process itself beyond its negative attributes. And this could include feeling unheard, not being treated as a co creator, access fatigue, internalizing shame and stigma. The list goes on. And this kind of technology really also does remind me of another sort of app called Sense to Know. And that would just be another way to quantify eye movements and child screen time in relation to the diagnostic process. These are all just ways to think about different technologies, essentially. Case study 2 is a machine learning model that uses 28 features to predict autism using data from a data pool. Wow, that's a lot of ethics in one small setting. You can think about your immediate thoughts and reactions to this and how something like a screening tool can be implemented in a way that clinicians can communicate and in a way that might actually increase access without almost gilding over some of those healthcare disparities that already exist. And so now we can actually turn and ask who actually defines a healthy mind, anyways. Even with tools such as AI technologies, there are power dynamics of who defines a healthy mind, especially with the power dynamics of the patient clinician relationship. As an example of ANN or artificial neural network processing, you can take an area of the brain and classify it according to different categories. And so if you frame a kind of category as an autistic brain against an idea of a healthy brain, what does that actually say about autists? So how can technology be integrated in a diagnosis process where patients often feel overlooked as knowers and often feel ignored? And so there are some fundamental aspects to meeting people with autism where they are before technological intervention also complicates the diagnostic process. If something such as autism biomarkers are something to look for and to document and to document and to document, the function of neuroscience is more effective when it's a yes and to including autism community members in key decisions, who has the power to classify anyways. And if somebody needs a diagnosis to have support systems, then using AI and technologies and diagnosis tools should be a joint decision. If the technology is already integrated, the use of AI really needs to be revamped and made over to acknowledge its limitations. And these are some suggestions for best practices. What I really wanted to do, though, was focus on that middle box. And that's essentially this idea that the use of AI diagnosing autism must account for the idea that an algorithm presents an idiosyncratic definition. The AI technology tool doesn't actually account for those complexities, as I've iterated over and over and over. And this is essentially a more accessible way of looking at those practices. And so I would like to practice a little bit of what I value here. And this would just be the following. We can also add to this list in our discussion. Respect and value autistic voices in use and creation of implementation of technologies. Encourage multidisciplinary collaboration, speaking beyond the silos of your institutions or departments. Increase humanities, ethics, and communication hours in clinical and contact medical education. Establish robust auditing processes. Reframe autism beyond a deficit-only scope in policy and practice. And really just take time, slow down, stop the clock to really assess the risks and benefits of an AI system. How autism diagnosis is more than simply a medical process. It is a story, it's a narrative with values, with definitions that you can churn and for over and over again, and it can mean differently at different moments in time. And this would just be the full inclusion, again, in procedures, rather than having autists existing at the margins thereof. Truly having that radical empathy and engaged listening. And that would be to undo stereotypes and oppression at all levels, socially, globally, at the institutional scale, and at the interpersonal. These biases and oppressions exist at every single one of them. And so it would take consideration of every single one, again, to really turn them over. Here is a QR code of resources of this presentation, of the write-up itself. Please feel free also to email me if you would like these slides, if you're having difficulties with that code. Sometimes it can be a bit finicky if you're using your phone and you have a laptop or you're dialing in on your phone. Again, well, technology. This is another set of resources too, essentially. Or it could be the same one and I forgot to delete one slide. It happens. And once again, here's my contact information so that we can discuss these comments further. Want to have a chat, process something such as autism diagnosis, or really just mull about where we are in our current moment? I'm here. I don't think I'm going anywhere anytime soon. And finally, we do have some time for questions. And so here it is. Is it possible for the creation, use, and implementation of AI in autism diagnosis to be just, fair, and equitable? And I use those terms intentionally. Why or why not? And how can AI technologies be reframed as support systems? What are some challenges with that? And so with that being said, I will turn this presentation to its discussion portion. Thank you so much, everybody, for your listening. Thank you so much for hosting this lovely forum and for being here.
That was just so great, Samantha. I have so many more questions now, which is what a good discussion really does, right? Is generate those questions. Just wanted to remind people to raise their hands in the frame or use the hand raising feature in the reactions button. I wrote a question in the chat that I'd like to start with. I dream of a day when panels of autistic people identify other autistic people. And how would AI augment or fit into that kind of approach?
That's absolutely interesting. And so how AI would actually account for that in its own system. Oh, yeah. One of the things to think about is that sometimes AI can be used to mark categories of the social determinants of health and just kind of be flagged in different systems. And here I'm thinking of electronic healthcare records. If there's a way to flag something such as autism and neurodiversity, within the realm of disability as its own kind of category, that could be a marker for folks to think about the different kinds of support systems that someone would need. When it comes to actual panels, though, and other sorts of spaces, such as education, such as, society and culture, what we would need to do is essentially to have its kind of data pool and data collection to work from in order to implement and train a model to formulate that kind of tag. And so that the way that is done and the kind of machine learning, if any learning occurs with machines, do they dream at all? Is something that I would think about. And this is again from the perspective of a humanist who is interested in technology. Yes, I have a comment.
I guess a comment and a question. So with regards to Don's question, the comment is, I mean, with technology, you have the ability to centralize so much more data and have access to that you don't have the geographic limitations. So I think if you could have that connection network, something like a Patients Like Me, right? That's how powerful it was for clinical studies, is people identified with each other and then were able to share more accessibly than farmer trying to find these people and recruit them. But at the same, so in some sense, the positive aspect raises the question of, if you think the American Psychological Association states that neurodivergent people are a separate culture, just like LGBTQIA+, which doesn't require a diagnosis, they identify their identity themselves. So if perhaps people can use technology to help them learn about autism, but also maybe it could be a first-tier screen that they suspect maybe they have autistic traits. Obviously, it still has to go through a clinical or human perspective as a second pass, because there are a lot more nuances that the machine cannot detect or may not be programmed to detect or may not recognize what to do with, right? And so in that sense, I think, it would still be valuable, with the correction and the adjustments or the complementary perspective by the humans who are trained properly to help diagnose, if you want to use the word diagnose, or identify, or whatever is the more helpful word to it. But I guess the question for me is like, do we need to diagnose autism? I think there are benefits for identifying with it, whether it's your identity. And then if you have high support needs, then of course, because I feel like if you look at the way diagnosis is for brain disorders, it depends on how your brain evolved over time, right? But when you're a baby or a senior citizen, no one gives them any trouble to give them the support they need when they're a kid or when they're old. But somehow in the middle, people assume, oh, you should do things a certain way because they can't see your brain is different and they can't physically see why you can't do something or why it's so hard or why you understand or empathize why you do things differently. So I think part of that challenge is what you emphasize is it's more of a social problem, first, and until we change that social mindset, then the tools can follow to automate or accelerate that process for education, identification, and perhaps, I don't necessarily think therapy, but I have met autistic people who do want some sort of treatment to blend in, but not everyone shares that. But it's again the ability for technology to let the person choose how they want to use that technology or tool to enhance their quality of life.
That's absolutely fascinating with so many thoughts. That would be essentially using technologies as a way to put power back in the hands of autists, which is an incredibly wonderful goal. And just thinking through that at that base social level, who is believed at face value has so many ramifications. And we can also think of many instances where autists are disbelieved in the clinic, in society, in interpersonal communications, essentially. And so we might actually be putting the cart before the horse here, in it, like, to mix metaphors in a proverbial sense, if we're just thinking about the technologies and not actually focusing on how autists are treated anyways or perceived. And that other point too, integrating some kind of educational component to learn about autism, neurodiversity, and empowerment into that kind of system. That in a way goes against some of this idea of AI technologies as only being a tool for more and more and more classification, right? That would actually have a more built-in element to it. Definitely ought to think about there.
Great. Well, Samantha, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. And I think there was a silence in the first part for comments, and I personally was just flooded with a lot of different kinds of thoughts and ideas and feelings. And finally, I think they're settled enough that I can say something now. So, my I think my main concern with the AI is that it is a bit of a black box, and we don't know how it works completely. And I'm sure that there's different ways that it works, and then who controls, how it works, and who influences, these outputs. So I think that's probably fundamentally, my concern about it. I do think that, it's a very powerful tool for promoting discourse. So, having conversations, more sort of educational type of interactions, so people can learn and discover and get new thoughts and ideas, things like that. And I think that whether or not, it's going to become some kind of diagnostic tool or some kind of therapy tool or something that's, more sort of a clinical tool, I do think that sort of remains to be seen, like, and it depends on like how, it's one of those things where you sort of, you go through the journey and you learn and adjust, based on what the outcomes are. So I think some very close surveillance, is really needed for stuff like this. But I do think that it would be invaluable in terms of facilitating the conversation, potentially educating people on neurodiversity more broadly.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as you were mentioning that black box, one of the things that I thought about was exactly trust. Because in a way, that black box really does kind of create this void or a hole where it becomes difficult to actually know what an AI technology is doing just within its own algorithm as a kind of space. And if such a void exists, it actually becomes that sort of difference in trust. And so that kind of slippage can happen there. And in a way, that black box as a metaphor also risks almost deferring responsibility to that kind of unknowable quality rather than digging into the questions that you were mentioning, such as raising acceptance, awareness, celebration of autism and neurodiversity. Oh my goodness, I'm so behind the chat.
Well, let me read this question out loud. It says, would AI eventually be able to discover other forms of neurodivergence that's not covered by our current diagnostic methods?
That's very interesting because that almost gets into that sense or question of diagnosis. What does that term actually do? And identification. I'm really thinking about AI kind of in the realm of exploration and discovery rather than a prescriptive kind of model in a sense. But that would require an absolute 180 flip. No, that's really interesting.
There's another comment to be read out loud. It says, for the clinicians here, if you were presented with an AI tool that was proven to be more accurate than current gold standard diagnostic tools, would you be open to implementing it in clinical practice? I do question whether sort of accuracy, what I mean, it's, I mean, for me, it's hard to differ. It's a hard differentiation, diagnosis versus identity. The idea of neurotype versus naturally occurring neurotype as a consequence of our neurodiversity, versus something that you would aligns with a medical code, that's focused on pathology. I mean, I guess it would depend, so it's really the purpose of why somebody may want identification. I think that really has a lot to do with it. I think the AI can maybe help, may be able to help sort that out, in terms of providing more sort of information, different perspectives, facilitate a conversation. But the idea of a gold standard, that I do find I'm kind of uncomfortable with that. You know, only because it has a very uh, sort of pathological stance to it, and I think in a very sort of narrow and restricted setting, those kinds of tools might be helpful. But I think those are also things that we have to, we really have to think about very carefully, and I think a lot of surveillance and ongoing development and conversations and monitoring the effects of these things is going to be super important to see if something like that may actually help people. I mean, I think that is at the end of the day the purpose is how does this actually improve people's lives. Less concerned about like diagnosis or no diagnosis or what the labels are, but if you do have something that's used clinically, at the end of the day, how many people are benefiting? And I know that's not a very concrete answer, but I think a lot of this stuff is we don't know, and it's so great that we're having this conversation.
Yes, putting a linchpin in what we don't know. Exactly. That too was part of that diagnostic process, or even that question of identification. In some cases, could an AI be a way to test or to do kind of a smell check if you're prescribing a kind of pharmaceutical prescription, if the dosage that you're thinking about could be accurate enough for a certain set of metrics and measures, um, and just kind of be another checkpoint in that process, potentially. Of course, I wouldn't be able to speak how such a system would work for folks.
This may have been lost in the chat a bit, but something really interesting that came up was, and several people have been talking about it, how co-occurring ways of being would really perhaps cause some challenges. For example, ADHD and autism. How would AI parse that out?
Now, how could oh yes, again I see your hand.
Oh, just to build upon Don's comment, and I think that's why. So I'm not a psychologist, obviously, but from what I understand, the reason why ADHD and autism tend to be overlapping or misdiagnosed because of the overlapping is because the psychologist has to find the true motivations behind it, which is really hard for a machine, which is why you still need that complementary approach from the human to interpret or to dig deeper or be able to evaluate the person beyond that preliminary screen of questions to diagnose. But at the same time, um, access is such a huge problem because, like, it took me 2 years just to find a qualified person, a qualified psychiatrist, because there were plenty of psychiatrists who just said, "Oh, there's no way you can be autistic. You did well in school." Clearly, even clinicians need education and training beyond the machine, and they have to maintain their credentials with e-learning and continuing education credits. So the technology has more ability to distribute that information and make it more accessible, whether it's from diagnostics, whether it's for education, whether it's for interventions. And it also has the ability for the community aspect that was proven during the pandemic, right? Where you could use technology to bridge that gap that you normally couldn't access due to geography and other constraints. But I think it's still what I think people have commented in the chat, it still requires um, the human aspect because it's still a machine. Granted, I probably like a lot of the machine responses and probably respond and reply more similar to a machine than a human, but I think the world is a mix. And so it's really, I don't know where to go with this, but like just you still need both. And that's why I think, anything dirty, dull, and dangerous can be left to the machines because most humans don't want to do that. But the creative, the relationship based, the interpretive parts are still going to be dependent on the human being. And I think the challenge, going back to Dr. Joe's comment, is the challenge with AI is like the black box part. Granted, you could control the black box by asking the rationale for AI, like what did you use to come up with that answer, step by step, which is how some engineers reverse engineer how the AI came up with the solution. And you can limit its ability to generate new content or hallucinations to some degree, right? So that you can be more strict in how you're using it as a filter, or if you want it to be more creative, but granted with safety rails, because when it creates some responses, I think that's the downfall of like some previous AI bots where it started being too creative, where it led to advice that was not clinically safe or sound. And so that's why some of the previous AI bots had to be taken down or stopped due to not having those safety rails and not having this bioethical discussion about where's the scope and what are the contingencies.
Where are those parameters? Still hung up on this idea of technology as a kind of bridge, because in a way, what the least it can do is afford us a different kind of space. How technology actually messes with something like time is an entire different set of questions, but that space is incredibly valuable in and of itself, just for storing data, storing these conversations, these thoughts and ideas and dynamics. And again, that gets to that question too of what actual values are you going to prioritize? Again, in bioethics, there are a myriad number of ethical approaches that you can take. And some of them might be more concrete or abstract than others at the end of the day. But what really matter is on the ground. How does the implementation make people feel? And again, there is also too that creative interpersonal aspect that AI in its current form and iteration cannot replicate. And so what is another element to speak of? And rethinking that value over and over again is just so important. Oh yes.
I don't want to hog up in case there's a lot of people who want to chat, but one thing I do see the potential that I would like, because personally for me, the diagnosis was really subjective compared to a diagnosis for ADHD, which was much more systematic, much more quantitative. And so by having a machine assess something, there is a bit more consistency. There is a lot more data capture too, consistently too. Um, and then also, for example, there's effective computing, which analyzes your facial or behavioral gestures through computer images, right? Which we can only do so much with as a human being of what we remember, what we see through our lens, which may be biased to some extent, and then how we record it. And so there are advantages to technology that may broaden our perspectives to complement the human perspective in understanding something. So going back to someone's point of can we discover new ways of divergence, like the beauty of technology is since it aggregates all these data points, you can see all the deviations or differences and then cluster them or, figure out more patterns or have the AI help you identify more patterns of different ways of thinking, learning, behaving. And so there's a lot of potential. It's just how do you approach the issue in a, as Dr. Joe alluded to, in a constructive way for discovery, for education, for identification, for support needs, and then how can you scale that for more accessibility, for more impact, for all these other things? Then the technology can be more of a positive aid than the negative biases and perpetuations that we've experienced, in part because I think it's missing that initial bioethical questions before designing the solution.
Yeah, I really like that point you brought up about the reverse engineering. In that, I mean, what would a system like that look like? you answer it, you interact with it, and then it spits out a diagnosis or a label. I mean, that's how useful is that? Probably not that useful, but in terms of all of the minutia in the data that leads to that conclusion, I think that would probably be the value of it. And these are basically tons of data points, tons of insights, that then humans can use, and in a very human perspective, use that information to help another human being. Whether or not you want to use it for diagnosis or identification, whatever, it's. I do think the value of that is the potentially the huge amounts of data, and I think more importantly, if it puts out a diagnosis or a label, and you don't know why or how it came up with that, then that's not of limited utility, but I do think that, if you're able to see exactly how it came to that conclusion, and then you talk it over with, people who are well versed on the topic, then I think that could be extremely valuable.
Absolutely. And just kind of bridging on both of your wonderful remarks, that really does cut to the core of technological processes. Bioethics as the after, not as the with in terms of creation. And that in of itself is a massive sticking point, so to say.
I just want to give you my hearty thanks. This is, you just have to come back and talk about this some more. I hope you'll be willing to do that. It's always such a pleasure to have you here for CASY, and you're such an amazing asset and a wonderful thinker. Thank you.
That's incredibly kind. That's far too kind. It's a real privilege to be here, and it's a real honor to hear all of your perspectives and to share this digital space with you.
Great. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I mean, I have to echo Dawn's sentiments. I mean, your first presentation was amazing, but this one, I've learned so much just through having this discussion. I would have never have thought or heard a lot of these ideas. I think it's really moving the conversation forward. So thank you so much. And if you come back and share more of your insights, we'd so love to have you back.
Amazing. I learned a lot from all of you, so thank you.
All right, great. Well, thanks everyone. No other questions, and we'll end it. And we will thank you for attending, and we will see you again in the very near future.
Yes. See you around, everyone. Please take care.